we go. 5, 4, 3. Well, here we are once again. We're at the very lovely and today a sunny corner at the corner of Glenwood and Lunt. We're in the heart of Rogers Park. And once again, we're up here on the stage at the Heartland Cafe, and we're bringing you another edition of Live from the Heartland Radio. You're listening over 88.7 Chicago Sound Alliance, and we are here every Saturday morning from 9 to 10. And my name is Michael James, and I will be your host for this morning's edition of Live from the Heartland. Today we've got two guests here on the anniversary of the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King. I have a friend of mine, Euan Hague. He's an associate professor and chairman of the Department of Geography at DePaul University. And we're going to be talking about his book, The Neo-Confederacy. And a little bit later, we're going to have another friend, Lon Reichert of the Eco-Justice Collaborative. He's involved with Transitions Rogers Park, and they're going to talk about that organization and an event that is coming up. So let's start off with Euan Hague. Good morning to you, Euan.
Good morning, Michael.
Well, you're a breath of fresh air every time I see you. When I first met you a couple years ago, you were doing a piece on Rising Up Angry, a group that I've mentioned periodically here. It was for Area
Chicago, yeah.
And that is a magazine that's put out by academic geography?
No. It's a magazine put out by a group of, some people are academics, but also artists, activists, community organizers.
Conscious folks.
Yes, and it's we publish two newspapers a year. And we're working on a couple of other small projects. We're working on a commemorative booklet for the 125th anniversary of Haymarket, which is obviously this coming May. And we're working on a book called Notes for a People's Atlas, which is, we've gone around the world actually, well not myself, other people in the project, and had people map their own cities. And we got some really interesting stuff and some great visuals, and we're hoping to pull that together by the end of the year as well. So
it's a newsprint, and it's always great when it comes out. I don't know what the schedule is. It just sort of pops up here every now and then, and it's got some very interesting material.
And it's free.
It's good thing. We can talk about free. We like freedom. We're about freedom. And part of what we're going to talk about today with you is people who have a very different view of freedom maybe than you or I do. You have a book that I just discovered, and you actually brought to my attention, called The Neo-Confederacy, a critical introduction, which you wrote a lot of the material and you edited it. Yeah. And I think it's apropos that on Dr. King's birth, now a national holiday, the last state to certify it as a national holiday, I believe, was Arizona. Your book, The Neo-Confederacy, talks about the history of the Confederacy and the resurgence of, let's say, Confederate national thought here in the nation, and how it sometimes gets very close to the Republican Party.
Yeah, I think it certainly does. I think it's made inroads actually to some of the fringes of the Republican Party. Some Republican congressmen and senators have brought members of neo-Confederate movements into committees for discussing topics such as immigration. There's some Republican politicians often mention a lot of the rhetoric of states' rights and the idea of nullification, the idea that states can reject federal laws. It comes out of this movement over the last 15 to 20 years. The language of activist judges is often hear from the Republican Party. I first discovered in reading some of the web postings of neo-Confederate organizations, the language of the idea that the federal government is, by definition, illegitimate, and detrimental to the United States. I was first reading on some neo-Confederate websites, and now I hear recently elected senators talk about similar ideas, and the idea of the 14th Amendment, for example. Neo-Confederates will often argue that civil rights amendments to the Constitution and civil rights legislation in the 1960s was illegitimate, and now you like recently elected Senator Rand Paul for Kentucky mentioning the same types of things. So a lot of the ideas that were fermenting within the neo-Confederate movement between the late 1980s, mid-1990s into the 2000s are now getting a more mainstream audience and a more mainstream voice with elected officials reiterating some of them.
Well, just so we got it straight for the listening audience, give me a short paragraph on what is Neo-Confederacy.
Neo-Confederacy is a movement, an ideology which basically argues that a lot of the United States went astray after the Civil War, and that the authentic America is that existed between 1776 and 1860, and that the Confederate States were an effort to save that America. And since 1860 and 1865, the end of the Civil War, there's been an illegal expansion of federal power. And as a result, these people bring sort of pre-1860 ideas back into sort of contemporary political language of nationalism, language of secession, language of political rights, and so forth. And so they argued that a lot of, and this is a contemporary movement, a contemporary set of politics, but it draws heavily on these pre-1860 precedents for all aspects of life. From, they argue that education curricula were better before the Civil War. They argue that schooling, gender relations, social relations, communities, and so forth were structured better prior to the Civil War, and then again in the 1920s and 30s is kind of a sort of second golden age that they talk about, which hopefully is a sort of height of Jim Crow segregation and so forth.
Well, as a young guy, and let's talk about the late 40s and into the 50s, you know, I have to confess that we had a little group called the Night Riders, and we grew up on Redcoat Road in Connecticut, which was named after, I guess, when the British came to burn the hat factories in Danbury, Connecticut. And we kind of resented the people moving in, new suburbanites. They came after we had already moved in. But our little band of guys, the Night Riders on bicycles, kind of identified with the Confederates. And I remember in the movies, you know, that just really liking the rebels,
right?
And I think that to Hollywood very much in those early days portrayed the rebels as sympathetic figures. You know, they were more romantic. They were the good guys. They were the fighters. To me, they were cooler. And it took a while, but it didn't take too long till I really found out that it was not about just being some kind of rebel. It was about slavery. And, you know, we also grew up singing John Brown's Body Lies a Moldering in the Grave, you know, but the troops go marching on. So we certainly had a strong dose of federalism or for Union troops. But throughout our history, there has been this resurgence, you know, kind of coming back always of the rebel flag, the Confederate flag. And for many years, that was something that people you know, took stand against, where you would fly that flag, and that was something that I think became prominent in the turn of the past century, and even today. And one of the focal points, I think, and rallying points for this Neo-Confederate movement is the flying of that flag and the reenactment of various events.
Yeah, the flying of the flag. We have a chapter by Jonathan Lieb and Jerry Webster in the book, which argues the flying of the flag really had dwindled in the 1930s and 40s, and it really surged again in the 1950s, mid-1950s, after 1954 Brown versus Board of Education. You see the battle flag, the familiar blue X with the stars on the orange background. You see that incorporated into state flags in the mid-1950s in a way that it wasn't before, and you see it increasingly being used at particularly by the Dixiecrats in the late 40s, that really brought the flag back into popular consciousness as an anti-segregation, as anti-integration symbol. And I think one of the things, though, that Neo-Confederates have tried to do is give the flag a new meaning. They talk a lot about the Confederate flag being a Christian symbol. The X in Europe is the X is the cross of St. Andrew, which is the patron saint of Scotland, and they often draw on this to say, hey, look, this is a well-known Christian symbol. It's not a symbol of racism. It's not a symbol of the Confederacy in a negative way. It's a symbol of Confederacy in a positive way. It's a Christian symbol. And so there's been a lot of efforts by Neo-Confederates to write books and monographs and treaties to give the flag a new meaning, when I think it's fair to say it's very much associated with opposition to civil rights, opposition to integration, and so forth.
Well, it seems like even today, I know the book has been out a few years, but there's certainly been a resurgence of issues around the flag and the celebration of the not only the Civil War, but particularly the Confederate side. I think the governor of Virginia and maybe the governor of Mississippi, I may be a little off, but there's a bunch of people who want to talk about the Civil War, but they don't want to talk about slavery. They basically I mean, it seems to me that the entire Neo-Confederate movement kind of has tried to, at least on the more moderate elements initially, tried to turn the way it was viewed as an issue of states' rights and not about slavery.
Oh, certainly there's been an effort to erase slavery from the Civil War and talk about states' rights, economic policies, taxation policies, and so forth as being the rationale for the Civil War. There's actually, my co-author Edward Sebesta just published another book called Confederate and Neo-Confederate Reader, which actually publishes speeches from the 1860s, which makes it very clear that the right of southern states to own slaves was the reason for the Civil War. But so they either try and erase slavery as a meaning for Civil War, or they recast it as a very benevolent relationship where slaves love their masters, and that whole kind of, you know, the good master who wanted to have, you know, friendly familial relationships with their slaves. And so there's a recasting, and quite a lot of Neo-Confederate literature. There's a lot of books by Neo-Confederate authors which write things like Southern Slavery as It Was, Southern Slavery, the Real Truth, about slaves being more like servants who you know welcomed into your home. So it's a very different reading of slavery.
You are listening to Live from the Heartland on WLUW 88.7 Chicago Sound Alliance. You're listening to Live from the Heartland, brought to you every Saturday morning from the stage here at the Heartland Cafe at the corner of Glenwood and Lund in the heart of Rogers Park. And I'm Michael James. I'm your host for this morning's edition, and I am talking with my friend Euan Hague, who is the author of and the editor of Neo-Confederacy, a critical introduction, and it's a collection of articles about the Neo-Confederate movement. And one of the things that occurred to me while you were talking was how the Confederate flag gets soft-pedaled and its more negative meanings gets downplayed, while at the same time John Brown over the years kind of gets made out as a fanatic. And he was a zealous guy. But it seems to me, you know, there was certainly a movement in the 60s and the 70s with the New Left to kind of bring John Brown back a little bit. I'm just thinking it's probably a good time to start talking about John Brown and standing up to slavery.
Yeah, I think one of the things you're right, the Confederate flag issue often gets dismissed as a sort of a flag flap. It's just a trivial thing that people are arguing about it, when clearly, you know, the symbol is very offensive to a large number of people. So why is it revered? I mean, a lot of people would say, where else in the world is a rebel army from 150 years ago and a number of people who identified as traitors and treasonous celebrated in the same way? And I think John Brown, obviously, he's very negatively depicted by the Confederate movement. The whole abolitionist movement is seen as being a twisting of religion. That quite often the Neo-Confederates point to the Bible as legitimizing slavery in a way that pro-Confederate pastors did in the 1860s. So the Bible is often used within Neo-Confederacy to promote, as you can with the Bible, promote a specific position at the specific time. So John Brown, obviously is demonized, and you often see displays in pro-Confederate museums in states like Virginia. I have a friend who's done some work there with sort of heroically displaying a little piece of the noose that was used to hang him and so forth, and sort of celebrating his death. So there's quite some celebration that he was unsuccessful.